Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I'm joined with my co-host, Chris Crawford. Thank you for listening in to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Lawvere, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Crawford. And we have special guest Alex Harrison from Night Watch Knives. How you doing, Alex?
Happy to be here. How you doing, guys?
Hey, Alex.
Doing good. So, Night Watch Knives. You have a great online presence, except for the fact that you don't have a website. But it seems like all of your knives are on everybody else's websites. So, can you talk a little bit about Night Watch Knives? After maybe you give us a little bit of information about who Alex is and like how you got into it.
Sure. So Alex has been in law enforcement going on 8 years now. Right now I'm a detective, and I have to apologize in advance for everyone at home. I'm not going to give a whole lot of information about that because my superiors have asked me not to. But I spent about a year working in the jail, the sheriff's office that I work for, and then I spent about 6 years on the patrol division, working the road almost entirely on the night shift, which is kind of where the name comes from. And they don't pay us that much in the industry overall. So one of the many things that just me as a person being inherently attracted to knives, I just always have been, that occurred to me was the very stubborn, bullheaded thought of, if I need a good knife for work, I might as well just make it myself since I can't afford one. And it is that harebrained, born of ignorance thought that has snowballed over the past 6-ish years. And now here I am.
Yeah, that was my problem with hunting and fishing. I was like, I'm definitely going to build my own, and then like $60,000+ later in tool investments and other things like that, I'm like, I should have just bought a $450 custom knife.
Yes, sir, you should have. And now here you are with us.
Yeah, yep. Did you know that the Night Watch is also a famous painting by Rembrandt from 1642?
I did, and I have been trying to find the right artist to do a parody of that for us for a very long time. Because I can see it in my head. I'm just waiting to run into the person with the right style.
Yeah, you're gonna have to look out on Fiverr or something like that and try to get somebody to do a mock-up for you.
Now, but what fun is that? You want to find someone who matters to you.
Yeah. Well, so are you taking bids for a Rembrandt photo? So if people are listening and they're really good at mock Rembrandts, they can contact you.
Absolutely not. Don't contact me for any reason ever.
No, especially if you want a knife.
Correct.
So, talk to me a little bit about how you got into knives. Like, what other than getting into making knives and the poor decisions instead of buying a custom knife for yourself, what got you into knives, period?
I think poor decision is the hallmark word there. When I was young, I had this, prototypical boyhood infatuation with knives and guns and weapons and fighting and action movies and whatever. And I found it easier to find and subsequently carry a knife than I did at 14, 16, 18 years of age to carry a gun. They didn't lower the age for concealed carry in Missouri to 18 until after I was 21, if I remember correctly. So I carried knives because that's what I could have, and I was attracted to them because that's what I could have. And then, of course, the more you grow up and get into that world, you stop looking at them like a mall ninja kind of thing, and you start to understand what a tool, a good knife is. But I was always, I never didn't have one. I've always felt more prepared with something in my pocket, something on my person. I had a very early grasp on the concept of your everyday carry before I knew that was a thing, and that's just kind of the root of it. I used to get in trouble for putting holes in our drywall. I would get bored and throw a knife or just stab the wall for fun and not understand how labor intensive and expensive it was to repair that. So when we moved out of our house when I was a kid, I got spoken to about that.
Yeah, my brothers. So I'm one of 8 kids, and my brothers. We were horsing around, and I ended up through a series of events throwing my brother into the wall, and it busted it out. And so my dad made me fix it myself. But I mean, he bought everything, so like I feel like the lesson should have been like pay for the materials and then also do the work, and you know what it's like to be an adult. But I didn't learn that until I was a little bit older. So like I don't destroy my own property because I know like the ramifications of the expenditure. Uh, so
Baby
yeah,
steps.
yeah. It's what they say, life is a progression from birth to death, and so like what is your in between, right? Mine has been learning about the expense of life.
Yeah, specifically drywall. Yeah, I'm
Yeah,
there with you.
exactly. Yeah, which is getting more expensive, like inflation.
Yeah.
So, um, talk a little bit more about how you got into Night Watch knives. Like, I mean, what founding? What other than you building your knives for you? Like, how did this like all like start? Because for people who are familiar with your brand and your knives, I think it makes sense they've been there from the beginning. But for people who know not that much about Night Watch knives, talk a little bit about like the early years.
Yeah. So I 20 at the very end of 2016, I bought my first house and started messing around in the basement. There was an old bench that someone had built with an ancient bench vise there, and that's half your knife shop right there. Um, and like everyone else, you start with a $30 Harbor Freight grinder, and you work your way up, and you start making mistakes until they stop looking like mistakes. But um, I couldn't tell you how long it took me to brand myself. I know that originally the name I came up with was V as in Victor 58 Edgeworks. I liked that because it was a sideways allusion to, at the time, the statistic was every 58 hours a peace officer is killed in the line of duty. And the V just stood for Valhalla because we gotta make it about Vikings somehow. Um, and I thought that was really depthy, and I thought it was really cool, and I thought it was very evocative of or invocative when it comes to trying to get people to ask what's the story. Oh, this is our story. It didn't work. Nobody asked. They didn't care. And realizing that one, it wasn't making people ask what does your name mean, what's the story, and two, the layman looking and seeing that it wasn't immediately clear what we did just based on the name, I had to come up with something a little bit different. So that's where Night Watch Knives came from. Compared to V58 Edgeworks, I think it's pretty clear what Night Watch Knives is.
Yeah,
But by
totally.
then, by then that was after my first time up in Escanaba, meeting Jim Stewart and Mike Stewart and at Bark River Knives and hanging out in Matt Martin's shop with him. And I can talk about all that. He very graciously invited me to his shop and taught me a lot. We ran through a Bob Loveless drop point hunter build, and I came back with a whole new set of skills to work with. And that was the first big jump in quality that I experienced, was after I got to learn a bunch of stuff from Matt.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is your interview, but Matt's a super good guy. Like every time I've talked to him, I always learn something just through talking to him because of how articulate he is. So
Yep.
I hope to get him on the show someday.
Yeah, I'm sure he'd be open to that. I know he had his own podcast for a while. It did very, very well before they stopped doing it.
Yeah, well, I'm not taking any advice from him on how to make a podcast popular. There's one like so I have to learn something myself. So
That's fair.
like he gets to like stay in your lane, Matt.
I'll tell him he said so.
Well, maybe he'll listen to this so that we could use that as a springboard to get him on here.
That'd be something.
But so what's interesting about it is that when I look at your knife aesthetic, I do see like your whirl of influence, right? Like who you went to for information and how that kind of applies to the way that you make knives. However, what is distinctly you is the patterns that you come up with and these nuances, like how you stitch everything together from a blade aesthetic perspective, is really interesting to me. So like I knew about your work before I knew you as a person, and I think the first time I actually saw you is when you were going through the probationary inspection for the guild.
Mm-hmm.
I saw you out there waiting in line, but getting to know you more over the years, it's actually been educational as well, because you're not like one to hold back an opinion if you have it.
No, I don't suppose I am.
Which is good. I like being able to like theorize, like talk about the theoretical side of knives and
Oh yeah,
how to
absolutely.
address certain types of problems. But um, talk a little bit more about your war wash finish. Not specific techniques, because people can find that out themselves. But
Yeah.
like it's super interesting to me when you apply it to knives. In fact, you actually applied it on one of my knives for a benefit that we were doing. So I thought
Yes,
that was pretty cool.
that was a heck of a project. I really enjoyed that. So Warwash is directly derivative of, again, Matt Martin's Tiger Lips that he does on his knives. It is um, inferior to, if for no other reason than it is not the seminal technique. But Matt was very gracious in sharing some of that with me, and I. It's not like you said. I won't go into detail because one, it's pretty straightforward, and two, it just I think would be disrespectful to Matt to go touting his trade secrets around. But the reason I keep doing it, there's two reasons. First, I can't help but see a finished ground blade like a blank canvas, and I don't. I'm not a fan of burl wood in general, or some of the flashier handle material. I just think there are a lot of substandard ways to make a less sturdy knife than micarta. So I really lean heavily into micarta, but part of it is the aesthetic. I think it's cool to add something to the blade itself that makes you look at it and appreciate the fact that it's unique and there's something more going on besides just a clean satin blade, which has its place. Um, but the observation I've made over time, and the real reason I keep doing it is so hard to damage that finish. And I'm sure you know, Aaron and Chris. I'm sorry, I've been talking like you're not here this whole time. I'm sure you both know. It's because I can't see you. I'm sure you both know that you can have a fantastic satin on a blade that you've finally gotten to look perfect, and then you set it down for a second, and the shop dust scratches it up. It's really easy to damage a satin blade, which doesn't make sense, but it is.
Yeah.
Um, Once I finish with Warwash, and my shop is the dust situation is completely out of control. But once I finish with my Warwash, I don't have to pay attention to what happens to that knife. I can throw it on the ground, throw it on the bench. It can get magnetized and covered in metal shavings and dust. It doesn't matter. I have not been able to figure out how to leave meaningful marks on the stuff. And I'm not saying it can't be done. I mean, obviously you can scratch up any knife, but it's just compared to everything else I could do to a knife, compared to a hand mirror, a hand satin, a belt satin, a an acid wash, like a stone wash. It's just the most durable stout finish that I know how to put on a knife, and that's why I put it on all my personal knives because I'm not a particularly careful person with my tools.
Alex, I'm not familiar with the war wash, but can you kind of explain, not necessarily the process, but what type of finish that is? I mean, you mentioned if I'm familiar with like a stone wash kind of, but what is the war wash? Like, how would you describe that?
Just a pattern etch. If you weren't paying really close attention, or if you're glancing at it from 10 feet away, or if you just didn't know your stuff that well, you would almost think it was like a Damascus etch. But the truth is, it's a multiple stage etch that involves a resist of some kind and a carefully applied pattern.
Gotcha.
Um, and Yeah, and it just, and I can send you some pictures, Chris. It's There's a couple different ways to do it. There's a couple of different ways I can do like a two tone where there's dark and light. I can do where the whole thing is polished. Just like Damascus. There's different ways to finish Damascus, and it adds something to it besides being a satin blade.
All right, yeah, I'm looking at your Instagram, and I guess that's what I'm seeing on some of these blades where it almost looks like you have a stonewash finish, but there's also areas which maybe aren't, that look more smooth. Is that what you're referring to?
Pretty much. The last three, last four, last five knives on our Instagram, on my Instagram, have like the polished war wash, and then if you go down to the sixth one, the black
Yeah.
handle yellow liners, that one's
Okay.
got more of the two tone.
Yeah, I got it.
Where
Yeah,
you can,
that's good. That's cool.
yeah, yeah, that's all it is. It's just a little something, something,
Yeah.
but I find that it makes a big difference.
Right.
Yeah, and something that I've found in custom knife making is that there's a lot of perceived value in Damascus, right? Like you look at people look at satin finishes and they're like, ugh, mono steel, like ugh, and then they look at Damascus and they're like, that's super great. And it seems so earlier days of American knife, like custom knife making, and into the 70s, 80s, 90s, in this like the guild, right? Having a high polished blade was like it, right? It's like
Yeah.
taper tang, high polished blade, everything like that. And now it's like I especially since Forged in Fire, the dynamic has changed a lot more to like the brute de forge and like the mill scale type of look to knives instead. And I think that there is a lot higher perceived value on Damascus now. Not to mention the fact that Damascus takes forever to make,
Yeah.
right? And it is actually more expensive, like $75, $80 per inch in some cases, right? But if there are newer knife makers out there that want a good tip on ways to add intricacy or appeal to their knives without a humongous amount of budgetary expense, knife finishes is a consideration, right?
Yep.
So stone washes, figuring out etching. There's this one knife maker that actually paints scenes on his blades and then etches them, so they're like aquatic themes or like all sorts of things. It's crazy. But you can figure out ways without having to transfer the cost of Damascus directly onto your customer base for builds. You can actually figure out ways to hack that system and do a finish difference than just a mono steel satin or whatever, and you can actually increase the quality and desirability of your work as well. So something to think about.
For sure. I mean, it's all about what you're trying to accomplish too. I mean, how many different blade finishes do you see Tom Crine applying? I mean, he might do some stonewash sometimes, but the fact that Tom Crine ground it is enough to know that it's a perfect satin and you want this knife, buy this knife. The same cannot be said about your average knife maker who just does, a satin, and because they don't have that years of clout behind them, and especially if your grind is less than perfect, it's just not as exciting. But if you take the time and do something unique to it, or you just add that extra bit of detail, even as simple as if you're going to hand sand your flats and then leave your bevels as a belt satin, it's just a way to show that you have put more attention, more care into your blade than I ground it and then it's done. It's especially if, as long as what you're doing looks intentional. If you can tell that you're maybe trying to cover up kind of a sloppy grind, because in my really early days I would like tactically place my war wash so that it would try and hide less than perfect grinds, and it never worked, but I thought it would. But anymore, you can look at a grind of mine and tell, and you can still see the grind. I mean, you're fooling yourself if you think you can't still see the grind, and tell that it's a good grind, it's an acceptable grind. So if it looks intentional, then it's only going to add to the piece.
Yeah, absolutely. Another thing about your knives that I actually really like is, your your progression through I guess the expertise that you have in knives is increased, and you can see that in social media and everything, which I think is a really cool thing. But your handle specifically looks super comfortable, like all of
Mhm.
them. Like I just look and see all these pictures, and I'm like, that looks like it would be very comfortable to hold.
So I have three criterion, and if a knife that I make does not meet these three, it is not a night watch knife. And the first and foremost of which, that handle has to be comfortable in every grip you can hold it in. So that's something that I pay a great deal of attention to, and it's it starts with it starts in the sketchbook and it ends at my 80 grit when I'm contouring it, and everything after that is just polish work. But it's something that I'm constantly putting care into, and I'm checking symmetry and checking it in my hand, and because that's the most important thing to me. They say that your blade is what you're selling and your handle's what sells it. Um, but the handle's your user interface. And if that's not comfortable, if it's not perfect, if it doesn't make you pick up that knife and say yes every time you put it in your hand, ultimately you're gonna want a different knife. And that is not what I want for my product. I want it to be we're collectors, we all are, and we have a lot of knives because we like to have a lot of knives. But if someone is going to spend their money on one of my knives, I want that to be a knife that could be the last knife they ever need, for that, at least for that purpose. I mean, you're not going to buy a 5 inch, 5 3/4 inch knife and dress out an elk with. I don't want them to pick up one of my knives after having spent that money and go, yeah, this, I just wish this was a little bit more this, or this edge is just not quite comfortable for me. That that's the most important thing for me, is the user interface, is the handle comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, oddly enough, all right, if you look at prison shanks, and follow me on this obtuse like thought here.
Yeah.
If you look at something that's completely utilitarian, and I know that there are so many examples of where people apply like knife shape objects to shanks, right? But if
Yep.
you look at one thing that is common about early like hominid like tooling and stuff and prison shanks and other things, is that the handles are usually all very comfortable, like in
Mhm.
some way shape or form. It's an observation that I've made in the past, right? And so if you think about that, one of the first, like the most utilitarian things about using a blade is the fact that the handle has to be comfortable and usable. And what is on like to the like the Ricasso and up is subjective, right? But it,
Yeah.
it, it does have to be a useful piece of equipment at the handle
And I
by
think
itself.
you're right, and I think a lot of times that gets distilled down to how neutral is the grip. There are a lot of knives out there that are they are heavily contoured to fit your hand, and there's a groove for every finger. Sometimes they're even contoured to fit a left or right hand specifically, and yeah, your hand melts into that thing, and it feels like it's never coming out of your hand. And there's one perfect way to hold it, until you try to hold it in a reverse grip or a reverse trapping grip or choke up on it or something like that, and it doesn't make sense. It just gets weird on you. Um, it's a different school of thought, and I would be very hesitant to knock anyone else's work, because somewhere out there is a $120,000 art knife that also fits that description, and I'll never approach that level. But it is certainly not the school of thought that I apply to the tools that I make.
Yeah, that's something that like I encounter in my making is that I have meat hooks for hands, right?
Mm.
They're big, and if I apply the same rule of thumb for what is comfortable in my hand, everything would be a K bar,
Mm.
right?
Yeah.
And oddly enough, I have two modals that I go between when it comes to like knife utility. One is like the big knife because that's what fits most comfortably in my hand, and the other is a super small knife because from like hunting fishing days where I really just needed something small to get into areas where you just need to get into them, right?
Yeah.
It's the small knives, it's the bird and trouts, the scalpels and things like that that I produce, and I try to make it. as a utilitarian, where it doesn't matter whether I'm behind the knife or somebody who's big or small is behind the knife. If it has cross application with any size person, then really it's more about the aesthetics of the knife and less about whether you can actually hold it and it fits, comfortably into those grooves or swells or things like that. Because
Absolutely.
I'll hold a knife and that'll be like a make or break thing. I was like, this is a really beautiful knife, but I can't hold it.
Chris, I'm really curious. Can you kind of weigh in on the handle design, handle shape thing? Because Aaron and I have been waxing about it, and I would
Well,
love to know how you approach that.
so I'm a little bit different in that I mainly make, well, pretty much I only make folders and small folders.
Sure.
But so with small folders like this, like my little EDC, you're not really as concerned about a grip. You're not. It's not like you're clutching that thing and wrapping your fingers all the way around it like you might a larger straight knife.
Sure.
But one thing that I do is I really want to make sure that I don't have any sharp edges. That if you know how like an ice skate, I think about an ice skate a lot with the top of the blade. So an ice
Mm-hmm.
skate is, I don't know how wide they are. Maybe an 1/8 inch wide. The blade on an ice skate maybe, but they're
Sure.
90-degree angles, and they're extremely sharp on the edges. And
Mm-hmm.
so when after I get my pocket knives put together and sanding, kind of sanding everything off, with a belt sander, sanding everything smooth. Well, I don't want that sharp. I don't want to have like an ice skate blade coming off the top of my, the top edge of the knife. So, but one of the things I'll do is I'll just kind of hold it and without even really looking, feel all the way around the knife. Now, there's going to be one spot that is going to be sharp because I don't
Mm-hmm.
raise the handle up to cover it up, and that's going to be right where the back of the blade intersects with the spring. So that's going to stick up a little bit and be a little bit sharp, but that's the only place. So, kind of, I guess to the point of the topic, I'm not with my small knives. I'm not thinking so much about grip as much as I'm thinking about, is it gonna is it gonna make a hole in your pocket if you carry it every day, or if are
Right.
you gonna reach in and get a sharp corner or something like that, or a sharp edge? Is the handle, is it going to be smooth? Is everything rounded over? So I do think about those things, but probably from a little bit different perspective than somebody making a larger knife.
Okay, that makes sense. And I hadn't really considered that. I mean, when you're because I don't make folders, I lack the intellectual capacity for that kind of work. When you have like a mechanism to consider, everything else kind of has to take a necessary back seat. I mean, it doesn't matter how comfortable the handle is if the knife doesn't work.
Well, that's definitely true. Yeah, yeah, and that's a good way to put it. Everything takes a back seat. I mean, you can have a beautiful blade grind, but if that thing, if you need a pair of pliers to open it, then what's the point? And I guess that
Yeah,
would
you
be
got to use
similar to
this
what
piece
you're
of
talking
metal.
about. You could have a really nice, blade and a blade grind and finishing everything, but if it's not comfortable to hold, it's kind of the same thing. That one little bit, for a folder, it's going to be the mechanical aspect of it that might be the killer.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's one thing about pocket knives in general, that is a little bit complicated to get your head around, right? Is because in most cases there's geometry to the mechanisms. So whether it's lockbacks, liner locks, friction folders, slip joints, frame locks, all of them have aspects of geometry that are required for them to fold and to stay open and everything. All right.
Right.
But then once you get those things square or geometrically correct, then you also have to think about the aesthetic of whether that is a usable knife. Now,
Right.
like observationally in Chris's work, you'll see several things. One is that his profiles on his EDCs, especially, are very form factored. To me, they're like he has just enough handle material. They're just the right size, and they look comfortable because they're smaller, well formed knives, right?
Right.
but the other thing too is that like if you hold them, they're also they tactically feel good. Like I mean, there's no sharp edges, and I think that also comes through in his photography as well. They just look like good knives.
Well, I
Oh
appreciate
yeah.
that. Thank you.
So, talk a little bit about the different models of knives that you have, because Alex, one thing that I think is compelling about your products is that they're not all the same, like Loveless style drop point hunter. You have some, like, you're constantly innovating new designs, new handle grips and things like that. And I'd be interested to know a little bit about how how you prepare for that, and also talk a little bit about some of your wonky models. Like there's some that the handles don't look necessarily like they'd be comfortable, except that they are. They're just like insanely comfortable. And it's like this enigma that you've been able to design around some of these things. To me, I just want to know more about it.
Sure. Typically, when I sit down to sketch something out, it's because I have one idea or one concept that I need to build the rest of a knife around. And like, just for example, I have a knife called the Interloper that has a two finger split, almost like a riser for your back two fingers, and it looks ridiculous. It looks very sci-fi, I think anyway, and it does not look comfortable at all. But it makes perfect sense once you get it in your hand, and the that came from two places. You actually see that in a lot of modern folders, like tactical folders, where they'll kind of split the plane on which your front two fingers and your back two fingers rest on. Um, and you honestly see it a lot in older hunters. A lot of like ABS style hunters that get made, they have kind of like those two radii, those gentle radii, that you're that come to a point, a gentle point or a gentle curve, and they split your fingers. And even if you picture like a Bark River Bravo or something like that, there's that curve, that swell where your fingers rest, that does that. So that one came from just me playing with that concept, and can I make a slim little knife that everything I make is small. I like small knives. I don't know why. It just, to me, it's more like I you talk about firearms. I carry my Glock 48 almost everywhere I go because it's not my Glock 22. It's not outlandishly huge, and I think knives are the same way. If it's something you're going to carry around every day, smaller is better, at least in my experience. And I try to maximize the amount of utility I get out of a small pattern. So I start playing with different grips, and like the forward choil, I think is a great way to get a little overlap from your grip and where the edge starts. And you still have a ricasso, but it's not just dead space. Like if you picture a loveless drop point hunter, everything from the face of the guard to where the edge starts is dead space. It doesn't serve a purpose. And that's one of my favorite patterns of all time, but that's one of the limitations of it, in my opinion. If you're trying to make real estate count for everything, if you're thinking about, one of my patterns that has that choil, that dead space doesn't exist because your front finger is it's comfortable and it's not wrong or unsafe, but where that choil for your finger stops, the edge starts. So you have more control over it for fine detail work because of how close you can get. You can get your pointer finger right by the edge. You can rest your thumb right over the top of it, and you can do very fine precision work, feather sticking or whatever it is you're doing with your knife. And you don't have that wasted space between the functional part of the knife and the user interface. You don't have that ricasso that's just kind of there. Um, that's something I play with a lot too. And sometimes it's as simple as one of my good friends is Jimmy Stewart at Bark River Knives, and he and I riff off of each other a lot. And we've had times where and I won't mention any model names at all, but we've had times where he's shown me something that he sketched or something that Bark River makes, and I've said to him, I'm going to draw my version of that now. Almost like a friendly competition, and we go back and forth like that a lot. So I have a lot of knives in my stable that privately to me are, and I'll say this because I don't have one, like my version of the Bark River Barong, or my version of the Bark River Cub. That's because it's just a niche that I wanted to fill, and I wanted to present that design challenge to myself. And some of them stick around, and some of them don't. But it's always got to be a roundabout idea like that that gets me to put my pencil to a piece of paper.
Yeah, it's super cool. Now, I want to talk a little bit about like how you sell your knives, because I think it's important to know. Like, observationally, you have a really strong social media presence. All right, like when I look, like you're always responding to your fans or collectors or things like that, but they're also independently creating their own content, right? That has something to do with your blades. But what I don't often see is like salesy posts. Like it's not like he like this drop here all the time, or like go to my website and
Right.
pick these things out. Like like you don't have a website, right? I mean, I don't see it indexed at all. So like everything that you do is either through social media or through working with dealers, where like DLT and Buccaneer and everything like that. Is that
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Yeah, it is. I mean, just besides the fact that I sometimes forget that this is my side hustle bordering on a hobby. So the amount of time I have to spend on knives is limited. I mean, at work, the sheriff's office, I work 55-hour work weeks because I can, and because the work needs done, and because they let me do it. Um, and something like throwing together a website and managing a website, if there's a good working model out there, because I'm not the only maker that does this by any stretch, if letting a Facebook group do the work for you and building a following organically is something that you can do, I think it is by far the best option because it doesn't cost me anything. And as long as I keep the group under control, I don't allow like political posts. Eventually, now and again, a firearm will find its way onto the page. So be it. But I don't do like Sunday Gun Day posts or anything like that. They don't really crop up. Um, there's People don't post memes or incendiary stuff. I keep it very drama free, so it doesn't draw attention to itself, and I don't have to spend money on a website. I don't have to worry about how am I drawing people to my online presence. They're doing it for me, which is the way it should be. Because if I had a bunch of customers that were seeing my stuff and saying, I'd like to have one of those, and buying it, and then I never hear from them again, or they put it up for sale, they get rid of it, and they don't hang on to it, then I've got a problem. But that doesn't happen to me very often. I have a lot of repeat customers. I'm blessed in that way. I have enough people out there that like what I'm doing, and they're happy with their stuff. They post it all the time. They're sharing it in other groups. And I think that's the strongest organic way to build a following, because your reputation does begin to precede you as long as you're doing good work.
Do you talking about that? So, do you work off of orders, or do you primarily you build what you want, and then people contact you? Like, how does that work? And then what kind of volume are you putting out? If you don't mind me asking, just from the perspective of you are like a lot of us. Um, I would still kind of consider myself a hobby maker as well that can make a little money on the side with it. But you do
Right.
seem to have like Aaron said, you go out there on the internet and look, and you have a lot of product out there. So
Yeah.
what's your strategy for getting it out there? And do you take orders, or how do you handle that?
I do. My books are open right now, and anyone can get in touch with me and talk through an order. I don't hesitate to say no if you want stuff that is not in my wheelhouse. I'm not going to make you an American Tonto. I'm not going to make you anything with like pine cone suspended in resin. And I'll tell you that because that's not what I do. It wouldn't be a Night Watch knife if I made it that way. Um, but Yeah, my books are open. I'm not that hard to get a hold of. My lead time is a couple of months. And I try to I try to be smart about what I'm going to make in a given little run. A comfortable way for me to exist is 4 pieces in a week. It usually ends up being something like 9 because my life is chaos. But um, if I look at my books and say, um, within reason, I'm not going to keep shoving an order aside and shoving an order aside and shoving an order aside, but within the scope of how I want to space things out, it would be easier for me to do 4 belters than a belter, an Ajax, a patrol scalpel, and an interloper. So if I have 4 belters on the books and all the times work out, I'll message those people and I'll say, "Hey, I'm gonna get started on your stuff this week. Is it cool? Are you ready for that?" Because I don't take deposits. So an order for me is we discuss what you want. You say yes, that's it. I give you the final quote. It's going to be exactly what it costs. And then you're on the books. And from there, I'll tell you I'm a couple of months out. What I'll do is when I'm ready to start your build, I'll send you a message, check in with you. Hey, say, hey, you're up. Are you good with this? It's going to be a week to 2 weeks out. And it'll just be payment on completion. And, people say, yeah, that's fine. Or, like happened recently, hey, I'm so-and-so, I'm going through a divorce right now. Can you bump me to the back of the line? And I'll say, yeah, that's cool. As long as you communicate with me, I don't have a problem with that. And I try and space it out. Like I said, 4 pieces in a week is comfortable for me. Then I'm not stressing out about it all week at work. And I can kind of work on my leather during the week. But like right now, with Texas coming up, I've got 27 pieces on the bench right now, and
Wow.
it's driving me nuts. Yeah,
So-
but they're all going to be done by tomorrow.
So you mentioned a run. I mean, and then you also mentioned 4 a couple of times. Do you try to do kind of like do them in parallel, just I guess to save time, or you have multiple?
Yeah, pretty
at
much.
once?
Well, there's knives in every stage of the process all the time because again, it's just chaos. No matter how tightly I try to manage it, but generally speaking, a perfect week for me is, oh look, there's 4 patrol scalpels on the book. Let me message these 4 people. Are you guys ready? Yeah, we're ready. Okay, perfect. I'm going to start 4 patrol scalpels and make them at the same time, and then by next Saturday, they're all going to be done.
Gotcha.
And then I will message those people and they will pay me money immediately and I will ship them the following Monday and done. Does it go that smoothly all the time? Whatever. But that's the model that I try and work off of. My volume is such at this time that I have not found that to be an issue.
Yeah, that's one thing that's interesting is from a methodology perspective, you treat knife production more like a production company, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Like for me, and this is just the difference. Like I'll get orders, and I treat each order uniquely, right?
Mm-hmm.
I slow roll things. Like if anybody works with me, they know. Like with everything that I have going on, it's like it could be if you're in a window where I could get it done in a week, then I'll do it in a week. But if we miss that window, it could be quite a bit more time.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't really keep traditional books. I have in the past, and I've kind of pivoted back to just doing work that I want to do, and then people can buy it. But I will tell you that's I'm pretty transparent. Like that's hurt me in some ways because when I was keeping books, there was a flow, like an expectation to my customer base and the general populace on what that looks like. But then switching back to just making what I want and listing it, I have to have a completely different marketing tactic for doing like one-off pieces and then gaining interest from the market for it.
Right. I think to your prior point about the production thing, it's look, I'm a custom maker. I don't do once in a while I will send something off to have it water jet. I do everything else by hand, by myself, in my shop. I freehand grind everything. I heat treat everything myself. Most of the time I profile everything out myself out of bar stock. just because I place a premium on efficiency doesn't make me any less of a custom maker. But if you develop muscle memory on a temporary basis too. I mean, so I have a knife called the Ajax, and it's got a hand ground fuller in it, and it's hollow ground, and it's got a swedge on it. It's a pretty involved grind, and I've probably made 100 of those things. But if I sit down and if I grind 5 Ajaxes, they'll all be within spec. I'm not going to send anything out if it's not to my satisfaction. But the 5th one in a row is going to be the fastest and the best grind of those 5. I may be the only one that'll be able to tell that, but when you do repetition like that, you get cleaner and you get faster. Those 27 knives for the show, I glued those all up at the same time, and it sucked, and I hate it because glue up is one of my least favorite parts. But I got really fast at gluing on scales and cleaning it up and clamping it and going to the next one. I got to the point where I would mix my epoxy and I could do 3 knives before my 5-minute epoxy was starting to get tacky and I had to do the next one. And compared to, me just gluing a knife up, it the more you do something, the faster you get at it. And the more you can repeat a step before you have to change something, change a tool, change where you're standing, change what you're doing, the more you can just stand there and work, the better your production's going to be. Henry Ford was crazy, but he had that figured out.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't usually make. If somebody orders a slip joint, I'll usually make 2. I'll make one for them and then one just to have, and I don't really take orders, but somebody says, but also let me say this: I'm not actively making knives, so I'll usually not make a knife until somebody comes along and wants one, and then I'll make 2.
Right.
But for Blade coming up in Atlanta, I'll be going the first time and having a table. So I thought, okay, I'm going to try to make 10 knives. Mm-hmm. And so if I can sell them, hopefully make my money back and some extra. And so it's a whole different mindset going from making 2 to making 10. And because it almost seems like you're not getting anywhere. Well, for me, because you're doing the same thing over and over. And I've had to kind of get in the mindset of, okay, well, today I'm going to make pivot bushings on the lathe, and I'm going to make bird's eye. So I'm going to make 10 pivot bushings, and I'm going to make 20 bird's eye bushings on the lathe. That's my goal. Yep. Well, and then if I kind of get in that mindset, then when I get done with that, and I'm not trying to think ahead of everything else I got to do, when I get done with that, there's some satisfaction. Okay, well, hey, because that's one of my least favorite things to do. Okay, well, I've got pivot bushings built for 10 knives, and then, okay, well, now I'm going to mill 20 liners for my knives. But yeah, it's taken a different mindset. I've had to kind of switch it from looking at, okay, I'm going to build this knife to, I'm going to build these parts. Mm-hmm. And, but like, to your point, it is definitely more efficient because I have one grinder. I mean, I have like a horizontal and I have a vertical, but I don't have like a bench full of vertical grinders that I can move from one to another. And right. I've got like one mill drill that I use. And so to set that up and be able to do operation for 10 knives instead of doing 1 or 2 and then having to change the tooling. And yeah, in the long run, it's going to save me time. But I do like the satisfaction of getting something finished. So it pushes that out for sure.
You're going to get that tenfold, the night before you're going to leave for Atlanta and you're looking at your dining room table and it's got 10 perfect knives on it. That's going to make you happy.
Or just 10 knives.
Well, be an optimist about it.
Yeah, there you go.
You don't worry. You'll think they're perfect. You won't see what's wrong with them until you get to your table in Atlanta. That's how it goes every time. Truth. Matt Martin said to me at the last Blade show, he says to me, I'm standing at his table and he says, oh, the light in here is really flattering this year for some reason. They must have changed it out. And I was like, Matt, your knives are perfect. It doesn't matter what the light is. There's not a flaw on any of these knives. So, maybe an hour later, he's standing at my table and we're jaw jacking. And I was like, no, you're right. I think the light is better over here by the booths than at the tables where I was before. And he gives me the same look. He's like, no, your knives are getting better, Alex. I was like, I'm not comfortable with that statement. Get away from me. Get away from my table.
Yeah, I think I think a common problem in most crafts or most like in intelligent types of positions is imposter syndrome. It's
Oh,
like,
absolutely.
am I really any good, or am I just faking it until I make it? And I think
Hmm.
that, in that's one thing we've talked about this in some past podcasts and whatnot. It's what does validation actually look like? And as an artist, there's nobody that's going to give you the best nod to your work than yourself, because that's the one where you come full circle and realize that you're doing all right. There's people that comment on my work sometimes and say, "Hey, this is good," but I don't really let that. There's something in me that doesn't excite my ego too much, because,
Right.
like, there's lots of people that will give me comments on it, like people that I admire, where I'm not sure whether they're just being kind to encourage me or whether legitimately I push beyond myself and they're impressed, right?
Right.
But it doesn't affect, like if I go back in the shop and I'm like, okay, well, how do I actually replicate this for next time? Like this feeling of euphoria where I felt that the knife was great, that other people do as well, and then how do I lather, rinse, repeat that for works in the future, right?
Yeah.
and and that's like how do you commit that to permanent memory where you can always do that, and it's just the next thing that you can push into. And uh I again, like your knives, really, the quality constantly gets better. But I definitely identify with like shows being the worst place to notice flaws. Like at my
Yep.
first few shows, I would just pack a bunch of refinishing material. It's like, okay, if I notice just this errant scratch on my satin finish, what am
Yep.
I going to do? How am I going to buff this thing? And that actually is a subject probably for maybe a micro podcast or something on how to bring an emergency kit, because like you can bring a like you can't bring your buffing wheel with you from home, but you
Right.
can't bring a Dremel with the same kind of compound that you use and buff errant scratches and things like that out. And I found myself sometimes doing that. It's just something about it where like I didn't maybe I didn't inspect things as good as I should have at home, but
Hmm.
it like everything looked fine. Like you're checking all these boxes off and whatnot, and then you get to a show or where you're supposed to be, and it's like just this one thing. You're like, I think I could have done it a little bit better.
So, okay, hot take. If you're going to do that, your emergency kit should be WD 40, paper towels, and a piece of doe skin. Because if you can't fix what you have going on with those three things, you don't need to be worrying about it. All of the effort, and this is getting into the black hole that is the mental health of a craftsman, and that's not something to be taken lightly. All of the effort and the grief and the stress that you've put into leading up to that show, where even if you're a full-time knife maker, you're not getting paid for all the time you're spending on that show. So you have made yourself a hobbyist again because there's no money in it until you sell it at the show. So all of that energy has come to a point there, and it's the work is done. There's no more to be done. There's no point in stressing yourself out trying to fix something that you didn't notice until you got there. So you have two choices. You can either put it under the table and decide not to sell it, fix it when you go home and sell it to someone online or whatever. Or you can say, this is the knife that I have. And if someone wants to buy it, they'll buy it. If someone doesn't, they don't. But either way, when you're standing at that table, you have to present the best version of yourself that you can for these people. And you have to remember that this is the closest thing to a vacation that you're ever going to get, hanging around all of your knife people and enjoying yourself and seeing all the cool stuff that you only see on Instagram and like, oh God, there goes Jason Knight and all the like, pseudo celebrities that are in this world. Um, you're supposed to be there to have fun. You are supposed to hang out with your friends that you never get to see. You are supposed to enjoy yourself because that's your reward for putting in all that extra work and going to the show. Guys like Jason Knight or Matt Martin could do the same thing and sell everything they make without ever leaving their shop because they have that following. They go to the show for the show experience. So you have to value that for what it is. If you're not present, if you're cheating yourself and ultimately just creating a negative association in your head, because in 6 months or in 9 months, when the time comes to get ready for the next year's show, you're not going to remember that scratch. You're going to remember whether you had a good time and whether all the suffering that you're about to put yourself through is worth going there again.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, and I don't think that really it gets discussed a whole lot. Is there is like a mental health component to the craft that it just doesn't get talked about. I mean, I see like lots of knife makers getting sick with like cancers or heart disease or things like that later on in life, and I've always wondered whether that's a certain component of like the actual carcinogens and things, but and also the stress with the craft.
Yep.
But yeah, there's some advice that I had gotten early on that's like if you don't sell a knife during your first day, then you should go back to your hotel room and take a good hard look at yourself in the mirror. And I have never been the kind of person to really do that. And what I mean by that is that uh, there are factors to selling that have nothing to do with whether your product is good or not, right?
Yeah,
And everything to do with
absolutely.
the situation. And if you look at a knife show as like the de facto place to sell knives, I don't really know if that's healthy, because there are lots of situations where a lot of good makers don't sell any knives. And that goes from your local shows all the way up to the Art Knife Invitational. Like there are situations that are beyond your prediction or control, and it has sometimes nothing to do with your craft.
You're right. And there's a duality to it. I mean, you can't use that as an excuse. If there is a flaw in one of your products that you've identified, then that is because you were not better than you are, and you should be better next time. But you need to process that your way in your time so that you can deal with it the way you want to. You do not need to internalize some imaginary person's perceived opinion of your knife. It's not going to do you one bit of good. You know that you messed up, whether you knew it was happening at the time or not. You know you don't want to repeat that mistake. You're not going to repeat that mistake. So live with it. You just carry on, carry forward. You don't have to get it. You don't have to treat yourself like your own drill sergeant. You have to take care of yourself because no one else is going to. Even the people who are in your life that you love, your family that are supporting your business, your fellow makers, no one really understands what you go through except for you standing there at the grinder and processing what you're doing next, how you prioritize stuff, what's important to you, what you want your table to look like, what kind of knife you want to make. And if you lose sight of that, then that's how you end up with a table full of loveless copies that no one wants to buy.
I'm going to make a statement, which I'm sure a lot of knife makers out there would disagree with me, because I've kind of heard it. I've not made the statement before, but I've heard people say, and this goes to the idea of, Aaron, this guy telling you that. And well, let me make two comments. First of all, the idea about not selling a knife. Now, I've only been to a couple of knife shows. I'm talking about even just as a guest. I've never set up at one, so this will be the first time
Mm-hmm.
for me. And so I honestly don't have real high expectations, because I've been to a couple, and I've been to Arkansas a couple of times just as a guest, and then to Blade last year. Man, there's so many people at Blade. There's so many tables and so many people selling stuff, and like, what we had Matt Collum on last week. I hung out with him for a little bit last year at his table, and he had some really beautiful knives, and I think he sold some, and I think he left with some, but there's just so much competition. I don't see how anybody could make a statement like that. There's only so much money. I know there's a lot of people out there, but there's a lot of competition, and especially for a knife like mine. I mean, my knife's just a good carry knife. I mean, it ain't fancy or anything like that. There's probably nothing about it that's going to make it stand out, to all the people walking around. And honestly, Alex, like you're saying, anything that don't sell, I could probably come home and sell online quicker than I could sell there,
Yeah.
and could have saved my money. But I'm going for the experience. Um, but this idea also about, everybody has to have their own standards, and you can't let other makers set your standards, because I feel like, to me, there are times where I enjoy knife making, and there's times where I don't. And when I start getting stressed with knife making, that makes me not enjoy it and makes me not want to do it. And
Yeah.
one thing that I've kind of done over the years, because I'm not going to make a perfect knife, but if I run into an issue with a knife, now if it's something that's just going to make the knife not work, I'll start over or redo it, something. But I'll give you examples. It's this knife I was working on, I was putting bolsters on. I spot welded the bolsters. Well, when I was shaping the bolsters, man, I ground down. I was profiling them, and I got a little too far down, and there was like this little pinhole in the bolster from the spot weld. And so I'm sitting there thinking, man, I got a lot of time in this knife. I could chunk this knife and start over, or I could contact the customer and tell them. And this is what I do. Most knives that before, when I finish a knife for a customer, I usually send them an email with a picture of everything that I think could have been better, and I give them the option to buy the knife. And in his case, I said, look, I'm going to knock $100 off of it if you want this. If you don't, I'll be glad to start it over. I'm just going to have to, it's going to be a couple of months before I get back to it. And give him the option, not slip it, not pass anything over him, or pull any wool over his eyes, but show him, hey, here's the knife. It ain't going to be perfect. Here's what I see wrong with it, and do you want this? And it was something he said he was going to carry every day and was going to get scratched up, so he wanted it. Ends up, I had some other issues with it and told him, you know what, I'm just going to have to start over and do you a different one. But still, I mean,
Yep.
the point, if everything else had gone smooth from that point, I would have still sold him that knife. Now, a lot of guys wouldn't. But again, I feel like, for me anyway, hey, if I'm going to be square and upfront with the customer, and if they want me, and I've had them who wanted me to start over, there might be a little something with the blade, and they might want a
Yeah.
second one. And I was like, that's perfectly fine. I'll put this one in my pocket. Maybe I'll give it to one of my friends who couldn't care less.
I do that all the time. Half the guys in my office have my cosmetic seconds that I have been less than thrilled with, and I've offered it to them, like, say, hey, this is what's wrong with it. I don't want to sell it, but it's a perfectly fine knife. It works well. It'll serve you for the rest of your life. If you would like to have it, then it is yours. And that's what I do. I'll find a way to give it a purpose. I'm not just going to let it sit.
Right.
Yeah, and that's also, I bring these like a little adages up quite a bit, like philosophical type of things, because as a fledgling knife maker, when I was getting started and everything, those are some things that stuck with me, and like being a little bit of a contrarian, that kind of irritated me. So as I've like gotten better at knives and everything, I'm like, it would be nice for new knife makers, or those who are trying to push their own envelope, to talk less about the philosophy of knives, which is like an opinion and everybody has one, and just talk about how do you fix things. Like critically analyze a person's work or whatever, and be able to give them an opinion on how to fix the thing, versus telling them, well, hey, like you should have woken up on a different side of the bed today and ground that different, and you suck, and I'm going to try to say that you're bad in the nicest way possible, versus giving you real constructive criticism on how to fix things. You know what I mean?
Well, first of all, the answer to that question is always a Drysack belt or a black compound. Second of all, that's how you can tell, going to a show, that's how you can tell a bully from someone who wants to help you. And I've always kind of judged it by that metric. And really, the nicest people aren't going to offer their opinion. And Matt, I keep bringing him up, who's always been my best critic, and he's someone I'll go to, and he'll spot a flaw in a knife immediately and say, you screwed this up. You need to do this better. I have watched him walk up to my table at a show, pick up the knife I did not want him to pick up, immediately find the flaw in it, not say anything, put it down, pick up a couple other knives, and say only positive things about everything on the table. Because he knows I didn't ask for his opinion, even though I value it, and he knows I wouldn't be mad if he gave it to me. And he knows as well as I do, because he pays close attention to his mental health. He's an adult. The show is not the time for that. The show is the time to enjoy yourself. To my earlier point, Matt's not a bully. Matt is not someone who needs to point out a flaw in someone's work, or even someone who feels compelled to offer, unsolicited advice. He's just there for the show, and that's the way everyone should approach it. If you spot something, even if it's, you tell someone, hey, you do this, it takes no effort at all, and you've fixed that issue and you never ever have it again. If they didn't ask you, keep your mouth shut.
Yeah. Well, a word to everybody listening that there's a time and a place, and sometimes there's neither a time or a place. So, but so, I mean, kind of on that note, we ask all of our guests if there's like one or a set of things, like recommendations or advice that you can give to new makers, what would it be? And so I'm going to ask the same thing to you. Like if you've learned one or a few crucial elements of making knives that you feel that everybody that's coming up should know, what would those things be?
Identify the people in your life. If you are a maker, if you want to be a maker, if you're learning how to do this stuff, if you're in the very beginning stages of YouTubing stuff and listening to podcasts and just thinking, maybe I should give this a shot, know that you cannot do this alone, and you need to surround yourself with other craftsmen. You need to make friends with these people. You need to develop those relationships. Simply, hey man, I really like the stuff that you're making. That's the coolest profile I've ever seen. I love it, because those people will be the ones that are there for you when you have a question. So I have 3 people that I go to on the regular. I have Matt Martin, I have Jim Stewart, and I have Jim Skelton, because I know the 3 types of answers I'm going to get anytime I ask them a question. Matt Martin is going to give me the answer that is, he'll give me the hybrid answer. He will give me, this is how I do it, and it takes skill and muscle memory to develop, but once you teach yourself this technique, it's the most consistent and reliable. Jim Stewart will give me, this is how I do it, because I can do it this way 100 times in 45 minutes, and it's I've taught myself how to do it, and I've done it so much now, it's the quickest, most efficient way to do it. He'll give me the production answer. Jim Skelton will give me, this is the one right way to do it, and it's going to take you 3 days, and you're going to hate yourself, but it's going to be 100% perfect, and there's no way to screw it up, and there's no way to do it better than this one perfect way to do it. And the thing that I end up doing is usually a hybrid of those 3 and raw. And then I pick whichever method I want to go with from there. But the fact that I have that resource, that I can pick which method to go and hear these different perspectives on how to do a given thing, saves me so much time and trial and error. I mean, think about a weirdly, like, okay, cleaning up the inside of a sharpening notch. You can't YouTube that. You can't search maybe like in an old knife forum somewhere. That's such a weird, specific problem to have. But if I send Tom Grind a message, I'm like, hey, I've got a couple of your knives here, and all the sharpening notches look really good and clean and finished. How do you do that? And then he sends me this photo of this insane thing that he fabricated, with an old buffer that he's not using for anything else. I'm like, okay, that's not really useful to me, but now I know that there's a way to do it, so I'm going to try and back engineer that. If you don't build those relationships, those contacts with other makers, and have that, then it's going to take you a long time to learn anything on your own.
Yeah, that's really good advice, because there's always a learning curve with everything, and by and large, any craft is a process of elimination, and by elimination, it's mistakes, right? So all of the, like, let's go back to Night Watch by Rembrandt. That wasn't his first painting. Like, people look at the colors of the Dutch artists and everything, and the lighting and whatnot, and they're like, wow, this is pretty crazy stuff. Like, how do they do that? Well, a lot of trial and error, mostly error. And I think it's important. Like I do the same thing. My wife says I collect people, and as like full disclosure, I talk to a lot of people in the knife industry, not just because I try to be personable, but also because you have just a wealth of information from all these different walks of life and all these different people, and they have all different perspectives. And I have the fortitude to be able to talk to them and to decouple opinion to what I actually need out of that, which is sometimes the technical specifications of how to do something. And I agree. I think that's very valuable to surround yourself with the kind of people that emulate the maker that you want to be. And if you do that, and you can find some way not to bug them to the point where they don't like you anymore, then I think that you've hit a secret sauce.
I don't think I ever really tried to do that. Those are just the three guys that stuck around, no matter how much I messaged them.
They became your tribe, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
Oh, Alex, I really enjoyed talking to you, and yeah, thanks for joining us for this podcast.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure. I really appreciate you guys taking the time and inviting me on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll go ahead and post all of your social media information and everything. One thing I do want to cover before we leave is, because like people can reach out directly to you for orders, but there's a slew of dealers that you work with in order to sell your work. Can you talk a little bit more about them, how they can get a hold of how customers can get a hold of your knives from those places?
Sure. So Buccaneer Knives is one that we work with, and I bring them up first because in April I'm supposed to send a few pieces to James at Buccaneer Knives, and then we've done a couple of runs in the past with DLT trading, and there's absolutely going to be more of that happening this year. Nobody cares about my personal life stuff, but it's been a little bit of a roller coaster the last few months. Things have been slower than I would have liked in the shop as a result of that. But kind of getting back into the swing of things, I've got everything planned out for the next couple of small batches I'm going to send to DLT. And I think they still have a couple of pieces from the last run. So they've got a couple of those interlopers left, which are really cool. But going forward, my goal is to always have something available at DLT. And to have kind of a rotating basis, sending them, small runs, 20 pieces at a time or so to start. In addition to that, the books are always open on the Facebook group. If you pay attention to that, that's where I will kind of dispense of a prototype that I wanted to make, or if I, have just every once in a while we do a waffle. Opportunities will come up for you to snag knives on the Facebook group as well. You can send me a DM on Facebook. You can send me a DM on Instagram. You can send me an email. It's just nightwatchknives@gmail.com. Whatever your preferred method of contact is, you get a hold of me that way, and I can point you in the right direction.
Well, thanks, buddy. I really appreciate all of your time and talking to us. There's lots of good things that we can unpack from your interview. So, I encourage our listeners to really take a few listens to this, because a lot of the subjects that Alex is talking about are things that I think are highly valuable to new and established makers alike. So thanks again.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
So thanks, everybody, for listening to the Good Old Blades podcast. Just remember that you are loved, and God bless.